Welcome to the full court press for the Global Hydrogen interview, where we take a rapid dive into a market that many are calling the new oil of the 21st century. My name is 𝗘𝗹𝗲𝗰𝘁𝗀𝗏. I'm the director of the Energy Transition Dialogues at Gulf Intelligence, and I'm very glad to have Dr. 𝗘𝗹𝗲𝗰𝘁𝗍𝗆 with me today. She is the technology specialist in strategy and corporate development at Masdar. Hi, Dr. 𝗘𝗹𝗲. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, thank you for having me.
We'll dive straight in. We've only got around 15 minutes, so we'll get straight to it. Just to look at the broader picture for a second. So the potential of hydrogen, notably blue and green, in the global push for decarbonisation is gargantuan. The green hydrogen alone could provide up to 24% of our energy needs by 2050, helping to cut emissions by around a third, and could provide up to $11 trillion in infrastructure investment opportunities over the next 30 years, as well as many other very impressive statistics that flow along with that. And of course, the UAE is exceptionally positioned to become one of the leaders in developing a hydrogen economy, thanks to its established value chain, the leadership's vision and appetite for it, geographical advantages, and obviously its renewable market, which is growing and has some of the world's biggest and lowest priced projects so far. So from your perspective, because you're very, very ingrained in this world, how would you describe the state of developments in the region? Are you reassured by the level of progress? Do you feel that goals to become global hydrogen hubs and major exporters by the early 2030s, do you feel that we're on track for that?
Definitely. I believe that what would best really describe the state of development in the region would be the number and the scale of announcements that were made basically in the space over the past year. So Mubadala, which is our parent company, together with ADNOC and ADQ, announced the creation of what we refer to as the Abu Dhabi Hydrogen Alliance. And the aim of that was really to position Abu Dhabi and the UAE as a leader in clean hydrogen production and export, as well as build up the green hydrogen economy here in the UAE. And Masdar as well, in a separate announcement, together with some strategic partners such as Siemens Energy, Marubeni Corporation, Etihad Airways, Lufthansa Group, Khalifa University, and Department of Energy in Abu Dhabi, is also developing a green hydrogen and synthetic fuel demonstration project, focusing specifically on sustainable aviation fuel here in Masdar City. And this project is expected to be commissioned by Q1 in 2024. Also, the UAE...
Is that the pilot to be commissioned, or the project following the pilot?
No, the demonstration pilot project.
So that the 2024 Q1?
Yes. And the UAE cabinet recently approved a national strategy for hydrogen vehicles. There were also other announcements. So for example, ADNOC recently announced plans to develop a world-scale blue ammonia production facility here in Abu Dhabi. And there were also other similar announcements in the region, such as in Saudi Arabia and Oman. So definitely there's an interest, and we anticipate that we'll be hearing more and more of these announcements in the future.
And we're hearing as well, there's a lot of appetite for the talk to turn into action, not just in the UAE and the Middle East, but globally, because there have been plethora of announcements, as you just mentioned. I don't think we can go a day without, an eyebrow-raising announcement coming through in the news, which is fantastic, obviously, to see that level of progress and that level of momentum. But there's also this growing push for more and more action, more and more pilots, and more pilots moving to a mature phase as well, and evolving as much as possible. With that in mind, how do you see the evolution of the market in the Middle East? So, for example, there seems to be a couple camps of thought. One being that the Middle East, one of its greatest skills and tools in its toolbox is that it's got such great experience as an exporter, obviously with fossil fuels and the historical epicenter of fossil fuels. And it makes sense to develop a hydrogen market alongside foreign partners and have natural off-takers. Discussions have been had in Europe already. There's shipment blue ammonia last year, world's first, going over to Japan as well from Saudi. So these international partnerships are beginning to take place, and Moscow as well showing interest in what the Middle East is doing. So one camp thinks, yes, we'll obviously build the local market as well, but the export market is a huge part of what lies ahead for the Middle East when it comes to blue and green hydrogen. And the other camp seems to be saying, there's a lot of potential on hydrogen markets. There are a lot of markets that are closer to Europe than the Middle East. Transport is still an issue in terms of cost primarily. We need to focus on the local market when it comes to hydrogen for the Middle East. And maybe in time we can start talking about export markets. So from your point of view, because obviously we hear things from leadership, we hear things from corporates as well, but from your point of view, which camp do you think is most viable going up to 2030?
I think it's important really to focus on both. So one part would be, yes, building up that, I'd say, the demand domestically for this decarbonized hydrogen, but also, as you said, we've noticed that maybe some countries over others are maybe ahead in terms of the targets and the pledges really that they have set in terms of decarbonization. And they realize that maybe domestically the amount of decarbonized hydrogen that they could produce is limited, and it would not really feed or satisfy the entire demand that they anticipate up to that certain year. So ultimately they will depend on the export basically from certain regions which can produce this green hydrogen or the decarbonized hydrogen at significantly low cost. And we know the cost of green hydrogen is driven mainly by the cost of renewable electricity as well as land availability.
Because there are countries, Germany, for example, is looking to import up to 90% of its hydrogen needs. There are countries certainly in need, and the Middle East is certain countries within the Middle East are certainly keen to support that. I mean, the UAE's Minister of Climate Change and Environment said early last year, hydrogen produced by renewables, green hydrogen in the very best locations in the UAE could become cost competitive within the next 5 years. There's a recent report out saying that in areas with the most favorable conditions, such as the Middle East and Australia, we're looking at just before 2030 for green hydrogen to be competitive with grey hydrogen. So these are obviously very different numbers. We're looking at a 2025 to 2030, the 25 to 2030 ban. Do you think that's 2025 is the most optimistic we can be? The idea of being able to do it sooner than that, it's off the cards. That's already soon enough.
I think 2025 is yes, a reasonable date, I'd say, to basically start this, because as you're aware, currently there's no really market for decarbonized hydrogen, and it is one that is currently being built, of course, capitalizing initially on some of the existing infrastructure, but as well building up to that. And currently, for example, the cost of green hydrogen is still considered as a bit expensive, but we can't really rely completely on, of course, technological improvements to further reduce the cost. In the initial stage, a number of, let's say, mechanisms need to be in place to increase that demand and attract investments from the private and public sector to really bring about economies of scale and further reduce those costs.
Indeed, and we're talking, obviously, hydrogen itself isn't new, but the idea of a scaled up green hydrogen market, that idea is certainly gaining recent momentum and tangible recent momentum as well. And to be able to do that to a point where there is it's cost competitive, it can be established on a local basis, it can be a competitive export market as well, which requires obviously partnerships, and themselves aren't always that simple to curate. To the idea of being able to do that in even 9 years, by 2030, seems very fast anyway for a market that many people are expecting to be one of the most influential, if not the most influential, for the rest of this century. So it's a very quick startup, whether we're talking about 2025 or 2030. It's still very fast. And you just mentioned there about how it won't all be about technology, and I just want to bring in carbon pricing there, because obviously that's more of a market mechanism that will be hopefully instrumental in driving investors' appetites and supporting their appetite and ability to invest in greener markets, including hydrogen. So at the moment, there are around, I think, 64 carbon pricing initiatives that have been implemented according to the World Bank on their recent dashboard. And 1990, there were 2. So it's a huge amount of progress. It covers around 21% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and it's all heading in the right direction. But from your point of view, how much of an impact would putting a price on carbon, and again, even that is not a simple sentence because it's so deeply complex, but to put a price on carbon, what impact do you see that potentially having on the green hydrogen market this decade?
Well, I definitely think the impact would be substantial. But in addition to that, I think at this stage, yes, setting maybe potentially a price on the carbon is one thing, but then there are also other, for example, factors or let's say mechanisms that we can adopt in order to help reduce this cost. So I think we mentioned this previously, but if we set a strategy, and this would set really the framework, if we have some sort of regulatory and monetary support in the form of funds and subsidies, and then finally this target and compliance mechanism, so decarbonization targets or blending mandates, and all of these together would really be the driver for this transition towards hydrogen or decarbonized hydrogen.
On the technology side, of course, the area you specialize in, how would you describe investors' appetite for technology in hydrogen markets right now? Is it a case of it's the next big thing, we're really eager, we can see the potential this market has, like I said earlier, it's gargantuan, and I think that's a fair word to use? Or is it a case for some investors that, you know, we weren't traditionally in low carbon already anyway, now we're in the low carbon space, we feel much more comfortable with solar and wind, you know, we want to see the green hydrogen market tested a little bit more before we dive in? How are you finding it?
Well, from our experience, we think that there's been a great interest from investors in hydrogen markets, and this was evidenced in the numerous announcements, partnerships, and acquisitions really that were made by players from across different and various sectors, which includes utilities, industrials, oil and gas, infrastructure, logistics, and so on. And it was estimated that the electrolyzer shipments during 2020 were 30% higher than that in 2019. And we expect this trend really to continue because close to 17 gigawatts of electrolysis projects in the pipeline at the beginning of 2021. So investor interest is only bound to grow as well as supportive governmental policies and ambitious targets continue to be introduced, of course, coupled with the technology efficiencies and cost reductions.
And that 30% figure you mentioned last year as well, you know, to take that figure and put it in context of the pandemic and where there's so much disruption, the IMF was calling it some of the worst economic squeezes we've seen in nearly a century, different lockdowns, workforces have been impacted, shipping was impacted, we could go on, and still that 30% number. So, you know, in a normal world, that number would reverberate even more powerfully, perhaps. So we hear quite a bit, not all investors at all, that like you've noted already, how the market and from an investor's point of view is certainly ramping up, and governments alone have invested $70 billion in the green hydrogen market, and that is no small number, especially from a government basis. You know, obviously there's a huge amount of confidence in what this market can do, but we do still hear, perhaps surprisingly from some, that there is a bit of it's still considered higher risk than some investors would like. Like I say, perhaps investors who aren't traditionally in the energy space and are venturing into the space because, of course, energy and sustainability the world is mushrooming, is growing so fast. So they may be new entrants to it, and perhaps it's they who feel like they have to find their feet a little bit. Dr. Faye, thank you so much for joining us. We really have only just scratched at the surface of this massive conversation. I hope you'll be able to join us again as well, and we can dive into more of the technological details as well, because that market is going to be expanding so fast. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks.